What's up, ladies and gentlemen, Manny here. Welcome back to the channel, welcome back to my cozy apartment. As you can see, it's already dark outside. The days are getting shorter and shorter. I have an amazing rest day behind me. I got some good food in and some good recovery going on. And I spent some time researching for a bigger episode that I've planned in the near future about genetics for climbing, the ideal genetics for rock climbing, basically. And while doing so, I discovered that just by researching the topic of body morphology, especially height and weight, I got enough stuff together to make an own episode about that, and that's what you're gonna see right here. So the question arises, what is the ideal height for climbing? And as you guys know, just this little part of the genetic puzzle, so to say, is quite intensely discussed in the climbing community. Of course, the shorties say, no, of course, the tall guys have it better, they have better reach and so on. And the tall guys say, hey, of course, it's better to be short. Look at all the pro climbers who are short and stuff. So yeah, what's the deal really? Let's find out. But before we're gonna start, I want to say that this is, as always, my honest opinion. I have my own bias to this whole topic, and if you want to know about that, then I suggest you to check out this video here. And I'm not gonna get too sciencey and stuff. I'm just gonna state my opinion based on my personal experience, basically, and you can basically take it or leave it, as always. So I think the first thing we need to do in order to answer this question is we gotta take a look at the pros and cons of being short or tall on the climbing wall from a geometrical point of view. So what are the geometrical advantages, for example, of being tall? Well, of course, you will have longer arms, which means that you have more reach, basically. That means you can reach more holds in the same climbing position than the short guy. The same is true for legs, by the way, which are often forgotten. If you're very tall, then you probably have very long legs, which means that you can reach a lot more footholds from the same position. For example, those footholds which are very far to the side, As a tall climber, you might be able to utilize them and make a drop knee or something like that, which might be almost impossible for short climbers. And one argument which is always brought up against tall climbers is that they have a reduced ability to step very high footholds. But I never really understood the logic of this argument, honestly, because if you're very tall, then you should actually be able to step these very high footholds better, because you can still get some support from other footholds which are really low, which are really below your center of gravity, and can support you very well. Whereas the small climber, the short climber, maybe has to do a little jump even, to reach, to put his foot up there. Of course, only this works only if the flexibility of the tall climber is on point. And what I've noticed is that tall guys are usually not that flexible as the short guys. Maybe they are not genetically as gifted when it comes to flexibility, I don't know. But I also suppose they don't need it that often, and that's why they don't stretch as much as the short guys maybe. But if the flexibility of a tall guy is on point, there should be no problem at all with stepping high footholds. A shining example of this is Adam Ondra, of course. So I think it's safe to say that this increased reach also increases the number of available options for the tall climbers compared to the number of available options for the short climber. And you might have realized this already when you're climbing for a longer time already, but on many problems there is a tall guy beta and a small guy beta. And while the tall guy has a somewhat equal choice between the two, usually the short guy goes for the short guy beta, even if it's the harder one, simply because the tall guy beta might be very hard, even harder to execute for him, or even completely impossible, like for example a super low percentage dyno or something like that, which can be really hard for tall climbers as well, of course, but even more hard or almost impossible for very short ones. But we shouldn't forget that there exist also situations which are easier for short climbers, and although they are a little bit more rare, at least in my experience, we have to mention them here as well, because of course we want to make this analysis as complete and objective as possible. So what are the situations I'm talking about here? When we have two holes facing each other in a really low distance. For example, when we have this Gaston hold for the right hand and this really high like lateral side foothold for the left foot, only 1 meter apart from each other. As you can imagine, it's really hard for a very tall person to press himself in between those two holds, whereas the shorty has it easier here, of course, because he's shorter to begin with. The same is true, by the way, for underclings and really close footholds. As you can imagine, it's really hard to hold yourself on this undercling when you have to step really high at the same time when you're super tall, whereas the small climber has advantages here. Another example are really, really low sit-down starts of boulders. So all these are quite relatively easy for shorties and relatively hard for tall climbers, although not impossible for tall climbers, because when you're very strong, you will still be able to hold on here. Now, the thing is, we can quickly turn this around when we increase the distance between the holds simply. So let's say we increase the distance between the undercling and the really high foothold. Then we relatively quickly will reach a situation where it's almost impossible for the shorty, or impossible to at all, because he can't simply reach the undercling anymore, while it's still possible for a very, very tall guy. And of course things get really challenging if there is only a tall guy beta or only a short guy beta on a certain problem. And here again, I think it happens a bit more often that people say, I think I can't climb this because this is just too far away, I can't reach this, than people saying, I think I can't climb this because I'm too tall for this problem. Correct me if I'm wrong, that's just my personal experience. Let me know your opinion in the comments down below. Anyway, I think all this reasoning, this kind of geometrical approach to the whole problem leads me to thinking that the ideal body for climbing is actually relatively tall, taller than what's usually discussed. And I think something like 1.76, 1 to 1.78 to maybe 1.8 meters or something. You don't have to go overboard here. I think that's already enough to solve 99% of the climbing problems out there. Now I can already hear you arguing, but Manny, don't you know all the top climbers are super short, and this and that percentage of the top 100 climbers is only around 1.70 meters or something. That is true. A lot of the very strong climbers of today are also very short. So how can we explain that? At least shorter than what I've just mentioned. I mentioned just 1.76 to 1.78 as the ideal height for climbing, and a lot of these climbers are shorter than that. So how can we explain that? Well, we of course have to take another factor into account, which is very crucial when it comes to climbing performance, as you guys know, and this is of course body weight. Now the thing is that you have it quite a lot easier to be very, very light when you are also very short. And in fact, you have to be very light if you want to still keep up with the tall guys if you are very short. And I'm going to demonstrate this in just a second. In other words, we could say that being short doesn't really give you an advantage if you're not also at the same time exploiting the fact that you can be even more lightweight. Now let me try to prove this to you by showing you some numbers. I've spent some time collecting the stats, the height and weight stats of quite a lot of relatively renowned pro climbers. We've got Ondra, I think, Sharma, Alex Megos, Sachiyama, amongst others on the male side, and we've got Ashima and I think Alex Puccio, Jane Kim, and quite a lot of others on the female side. And because I already know I will get asked, I also punched in my personal numbers as well. So let's take a look at that. The first thing I created was a simple chart with depicting height over weight, basically, you know, to see how heavy are usually the climbers of a certain height. And what we can see here instantly is, by the way, the male climbers are represented by the blue dots, the female climbers by the red dots, and we've got also some trend lines here. And since I am not a pro, my values do not contribute to any of the trend lines. So the trend lines solely belong to the pros here. And what we can see is that the female climbers are quite a lot lighter and also quite a lot shorter than their male companions. And they are also quite a bit more clustered, interestingly, but this can be due to the fact that I didn't get a lot of data points here. I think only 6 or 7. I have more data points. I simply found more data from male climbers, so that explains the difference here, maybe. What we can also see is that taller climbers are quite a bit heavier than shorter climbers, surprise, surprise. But what is actually really noteworthy about this graph is the extent of this effect, which is represented by the inclination of the trend lines. As you can see, we've got here really flat trend lines, and this means that if a climber gets only a little bit shorter, he also gets a lot lighter at the same time. And this is true to an extent of being the smallest climber in this graph, which is Ramon Julian Puig Blanque, by the way, at about 1.59 meters. compared to Jan Hoyer, which is 1.88 meters. And this is a difference of 29 centimeters, and Ramon is almost half as heavy than Jan Hoyer. Okay, so that's the extent of the difference here, really huge difference. By the way, according to my claims, the most ideal body composition which can be found in this graph belongs to Chongwon Chon, who manages to have an incredible 53 kilograms at 1.76 meters, followed by Alex Megos and Sachiyama, who have amazing height-weight ratios as well. And another fun fact is that if I would want to get closer to the average pro male in terms of weight-height ratio, I would either have to grow 6 centimeters or lose 7 kilograms of weight. Now, just this graph alone doesn't really prove anything but the fact that short pro climbers are a lot lighter than their tall counterparts. And who knows, maybe that's normal, you know, maybe also short normal people are a lot lighter than their tall counterparts. So we gotta find somehow a value which takes this into account, and we can of course use the BMI for that. The BMI is somewhat a dubious and shitty value when it comes to assessing overweightness and stuff like that, especially with sports people. But when we compare sports people amongst each other, I think it's quite okay to use it. So what I did next is I designed a graph with depicting the height over the BMI. And if it was really true that short climbers have to be a lot lighter than their tall counterparts, we would see that tall climbers get away with higher BMIs than short climbers. And indeed, when we depict our little pros here in this graph, we can see that especially amongst the males, that the tall climbers have on average quite a lot more BMI than the short climbers. So they all have relatively low BMI. So the highest BMI we have here is somewhat 22, I think, which is normal weight. And I think the smallest BMI is at somewhat 16 or 17 or something, which is really, really low weight and actually close to critical underweight, I think. But anyway, as I said, the BMI, somewhat a dubious value. On the female side, not so much. We can see that height averages out here at 1.58 meters, I think, and this is regardless of the BMI. So BMI in the female realm does not matter. But I have to add here that we have two quite significant outliers here in this graph, and this is on the male side Magnus Midtbo, who is, I think, 68 kilograms at 173 or something, and Alex Puccio, who is also quite heavy for her height. And these outliers, of course, attenuate the effect that I'm trying to show here. So anyway, we can learn a lot from these people actually. We can see what is still possible, although they don't have the really, what I would call ideal climbing morphology. They can still climb crushingly hard, and yeah, that's actually quite impressive to say the least. Alright, now we've talked a little bit about geometry and also stats of the pros, and all that makes me believe that the ideal climber's body actually is somewhat on the taller side, maybe around 1.76 to 1.78 meters or something, and also very thin at the same time, of course. Now finally, I would like to add some thoughts which in my opinion are quite often forgotten in this discussion. First of all, we said we assumed basically that all of these pros that we compared here are equally strong. I mean, at least they are all pros, right? But we know that there are some guys in these charts which have displayed exceptional performance, not only in competitions, but also outdoors on rock, and not only on routes, but also on boulders. And let me just quickly explain why I believe that the outdoor climbing especially is so important when it comes to determining the ideal climber's body. When we take a look at competitions, we know that route setters have to set routes which are equally doable for short and also for tall climbers. And that means, which is only fair of course, because there are different athletes, there are short and tall athletes. So the thing that this causes is though that we cannot really take competition climbers and their results as a measure of the ideal climber's body, if you know what I'm saying. We have to go outdoors here because outdoor rock basically doesn't give a damn whether you're short or it's a short or a tall climber. You basically have to work with what the wall gives you, and if you can't really handle that, well, then you have to go and try something else basically. And this leads me to another point which is rarely talked about in this context, and which I would call the selection pressure in rock climbing, especially outdoor rock climbing. And what do I mean with that? Well, it makes a difference whether you're traveling the whole world and looking for that super perfect 9A, which just perfectly suits your style and you go there and climb it, or whether you can go to a crag, take the guidebook, see, oh, there's a 9A, and climb it. Both climbers climbed 9A, but who is the better climber here? So in my opinion, the perfect climber or the best climber is the one who is able to climb the biggest percentage of the world's problems, basically, without having to select away all those that don't suit him. And I would go with the almighty Onra boy here, if you ask me. And it appears to be that reach, or in other words, the distance between holes, is a very critical selective factor when it comes to outdoor rock climbs. The second one being the quality of these holes, by the way. And of course it is perfectly possible that a very short person climbs a 9B, for example, but the question is, how many other 9Bs does he have to abandon until he finds the perfect 9B that just suits him so well that he also can do it? And as you guys know, in climbing we mostly get the success stories rather than the journey that it took to actually achieve this success. And I think this is especially significant when it comes to the ladies. As we have seen, ladies are not only significantly shorter but also lighter than their male counterparts. And in fact also the smallest BMI belongs to a lady, namely to Ashima, although it has to be said here that these are old values which probably have changed in the meantime. But anyway, what I want to say is that I don't believe that it is disadvantage in max strength which still separates the ladies from the male pros. I think this is much more explainable when we take reach into account, because as we know, weight is such a significant and such an important factor in climbing performance, and actually I think that their bonus in less weight, in being more lightweight, would outweigh greatly the lack of max strength, which females of course tend to have, because they tend to have less muscle mass and all that kind of stuff, you know. In fact, it might very well be height and reach responsible for the still existing difference in performance on rock between boys and girls, and this only makes sense when we take into account that almost all girls that I showed you here are significantly shorter than their male counterparts. So I think this video is already long enough. That's my opinion on the great weight-height ratio question. I hope you've got at least something from it. Please don't forget that we all have to work with what we've got, so don't get too caught up in the whole weight-height chapter. Meanwhile, I'm gonna keep working on a more general genetics episode, so watch out for that in the near future. And I would greatly appreciate it if you would share your opinion and your experience in the comments down below, as well as leaving a like if you've got something from this video. I would greatly appreciate it. And until then, guys, I think I'll just say stay strong as always, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye. This up, throw it into a bowl of water and bring it to the boil.